Hello and welcome to BharatShakti.in. I'm Brigadier Chatterjee, editor BharatShakti.in. And today we are going to talk about the air operations in Kargil. This is part of the coverage of the Kargil war on the occasion of the Vijay Divas, and you will have seen a couple of our episodes already. The Indian Air Force is one of the pillars of our national security. They have participated in all wars, but for 1962 when they were kept out of it. But let's move the clock fast forward and get down to 1999 and Kargil operations. Our guest today is none other than Air Commodore Nitin Sathe, a very experienced helicopter pilot who has flown extensively in Jammu and Kashmir. Welcome to our show, Air Commodore.
Thank you very much, sir. Pleasure to be with you.
Right. I think I'll go ahead with my questions straight away, Air Commodore. The first thing that I would like you to comment about is let's say, an overview of the resources available to IAF, the Indian Air Force, for fighting the
Right.
battle in Kargil. How did the Air Force mobilize for the battle? Which were the airfields used? What was the mix of aircrafts? All that you can tell us about it.
Right. So, if you first have a look at the map of the area, the road that goes from Jammu to Leh, the nearest it comes to the line of control is near Kaksar, and from Dras to Kargil, that's an area of about 60 kilometers in length. That is the way where the road is closest to the border, and that is where all the action took place. So if you look at it, so we were looking at a territory of almost about 400 square kilometers to guard during the Kargil operations. For this, we don't require much of force, because the Air Force, being what it is, it can move fast to any place of its choosing. And but entire Western Air Command got kind of activated, and we had the Mirages from Gwalior. We had 12 aircraft from Gwalior. We had the MiG-29s operating from Avantipura. We had the MiG-23s and the MiG-27s in the strike role operating ex-Srinagar. And the Mirages, of course, were operating from Adampur and Ambala and not from Srinagar, as you would think they would, because they had enough range available to them. And also the MiG-29s gave the air defense cover. We had the MiG-25s from Bareilly operating for photo recce missions, the Canberras from 106 Cordon at Agra, which also did the photo recce missions. Besides this, we also had a large number of AN-32s, IL-76s coming into Srinagar with a whole lot of stuff for the operations, including war wherewithal, as well as helicopters of the Mi-17 class. We had about 8 to 10 of them in the valley at any particular time during the battle, as also the Cheetahs of 114 helicopter unit and some Cheetahs ex-Udhampur, besides, of course, the Army aviation helicopters that were there. So these are the kind of numbers that we're talking about. And all the bases in Western Air Command were activated for the entire duration of this fight. And basically, what the Army aviation helicopters were doing were the casevac and insertion of small number of troops, that is one at a time, two at a time. And of course, the helicopters carried out large guns, the medium guns, which weighed about 7.5 tons. They were split into 3 parts and moved from one place to the other. And also some smaller guns were moved from one place to the other, and also carried out the firing from the Mi-17 helicopters. So this is all in all what the task force at Srinagar was. And some of the task was actually being achieved from Western Air Command bases in the plains. So it was all an integrated operation of Western Air Command.
Right. I think that's a very detailed explanation. The next issue that I have for you, Air Commodore, is see, the initial air operations, they also included a certain amount of electronic warfare missions. Please explain how these are conducted and what were your objectives really. Recce also includes, I would say, electronic and visual recce. How did that go ahead along with this other missions of electronic warfare? And
Right.
how were all these things really merged together, undertaken? What was the overall concept, I would say, in one short sentence? What was the
Right.
overall concept of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance?
Right. So the ISR is the most important aspect of war fighting today. Without ISR, no army, no armed force can win a war. That is the bottom line. So, in 1998, during August, there was a recce carried out by an army Cheetah helicopter, which identified footsteps in the snow of the camps that were vacated. A report to that effect was given to the local brigade at Kargil and Dras, and the helicopter had gone back, and apparently no action was taken on this. So there was evidence of troops on the high peaks along Dras Kargil axis almost a year before that, and the firing had intensified thereafter. And when it went a little out of control sometime in the beginning of May 1999, the first requirement of the recce was made to the Indian Air Force, which was a Canberra aircraft. And there's a story about that, which we'll cover a little later maybe. And the Canberra got shot. So the Canberra did the first of the recce missions and found that there were in fact people on the hilltops. Thereafter, of course, flying machines of all kinds. We had the pods on the Mirages, which were used for ELINT. We had some Type 96 aircraft, which were used for gathering intelligence. Of course, visual observation by helicopters. Then, of course, the MiG-25 really was the hero of the recce missions. The MiG-25 is supposed to fly at very high speeds, at very high altitudes, but this time they were asked to fly very low and very low speeds. So they were actually flying at, their stalling speeds and very close to the mountain tops without any weapons. And they were the ones who got the real photographs for us. In fact, for the Tiger Hill attack, for the Munto Dhalo attack, these were the aircrafts which got the real good photographs for us to carry out the attacks later on. The other aspect that I would like to tell you here is that, the army operated in a different scale on the map. They had the grid system. We operated on the WGS 84 scale. So there was a little bit of a difference as far as, understanding where the target was. So therefore, we had to now unlearn and learn a few things amongst each other and find out where the targets as far as map is concerned. And of course, you are aware of the various, those little human things that came in beginning of May. Those Charwas, the Gujars over there had told us that they had seen some people from across operating in that area. So this is all what the overall concept of ISR was during the Kargil operations. And I think as we went along in the war, we got better and better, and we could get pretty good images as well as the grid references of the things across. I'll give you a very good example of how ISR was used in one of the missions. It was RT was firing at one of the posts in which you could not see the target, so they didn't have an observation platform to tell them where the rounds were landing up. So a Mirage 2000 got airborne at 2 o'clock at night, and it kept orbiting over that area. And the Bofors was asked to fire, a tracer shot, and they observed the tracer going up to 70,000 feet into the air and come down onto the target. So therefore, they could establish where the fall of shot was from the Mirage 2000 and give the corrections to the RT guns Bofors that were firing. And this was the real-time intelligence that was kind of made available to the Bofors to get onto their targets. So this is just an example that I wanted to give you. And otherwise, all in all, at that point in time, the kind of equipment we had, the kind of electronics that we had was very, very basic. So whatever was there, we utilized it to the full potential.
Oh, that's surprising. In fact, it's news to me that we used a Mirage 2000 to direct the artillery fire onto the target. I mean, it's something really, I think we must have been the first country to have done that kind of a thing. But let me take a cue from whatever you said just now about the Canberra being shot. If I recall, it's on the 26th of May. Well,
yes.
What kind of a task was it on? And I also want to know simultaneously, since it was the enemy air defense, so what was the kind of air defense that the Pakistanis really had there in the Kargil sector?
If you see the area, so I'll answer the second question first. If you see the area, the kind of air defense that you can have is only shoulder fire missiles. You really can't deploy anything on the mountain tops with the kind of jagged mountains that we have. You can't take heavy equipment up slopes, So it has to be actually along the road, or small man packs can be carried there. So the only thing that the Pakistanis had over there was the the shoulder fired, the Stinger class of missiles, and they had adequate numbers of them. As far as our side is concerned, we were also practically out of radar coverage area below a certain altitude, because the radar could not really look at low levels. So therefore, the aircrafts were really on their own with their integral radars that the aeroplanes had, and that were the ones they were using. So as far as this Canberra is concerned, this was the first, Canberras came into the Air Force in 1957, if I'm not wrong. And they have been used for a plethora of tasks since then, from bombing to what have you. And they have taken part in all the operations. So this was almost towards the end of Canberra's life. And this is the time when 106 Squadron was being used only for ELINT missions. So they had these little pods on the Canberra which they used to gather electronic intelligence. And therefore the, Perumal with his... Squadron UK Jha, if I'm right. Yeah, Squadron UK Jha was his navigator, and they got airborne for this sortie over Dras Batalik sector, and they were flying at about 2,000 feet above the rest line. That's it. They were pretty low, and they were asked to get some good photographs of the area to ascertain whether the Pakistanis had really come in to where it was being claimed. So this was the first formal kind of a mission that was asked for by the army to the Air Force. So while he did this, he heard a loud bang and one of his engines went off, and he did not have any radio also. So he just pulled up with extra, whatever speed he was flying at, he pulled up with gained some height and started heading towards Srinagar. And he checked his aircraft for whether it could be handled at low speeds properly. And he had a MiG-29 with him, which was giving him cover. So he was quite confident that nobody else would now shoot him out of the sky, because the MiG-29 was there. So he headed slowly, crossed the mountain peaks, got into the valley, and here he carried out his low-speed handling checks, and then he was able to, execute a single-engine landing at Srinagar, for which I think he was awarded a Kirti Chakra. If I'm not a Kirti Chakra, he got some medal after the war for this particular act of his. So overall, it was a mission which was. We didn't expect actually to be fired upon the Canberra. And this is from where the Air Force came in full time.
Right. That's a very interesting story. Let's go a little further, and I think it will interest our viewers more. You see, on the 26th, you also lost two other aircraft. One was Flight Lieutenant Nachiketa's aircraft, and the other was Squadron Leader Ahuja. Tell us that story.
Oh, that is quite an interesting story. In fact, this was told to be by one of the squadron pilots of 51 Squadron, and just a few days ago I wrote about this on Rediff, and so therefore it's quite fresh in my mind. There was 9th Squadron which had MiG-27s. They were supposed to give 4 aircraft for this mission, and then 51 Squadron was supposed to give 2 aircraft for this mission for the BDA role. That is the bomb. What is it called? To see whether the bombs have landed on the target or not, the bomb damage assessment, as it is called. So the 51 Squadron was giving 2 aircraft for that, and 51 Squadron was giving the escort to the strike. And of course, the 17th Squadron aircraft, there were 2 MiG-21s, in which Ajay was there, and he was flying for the bomb damage assessment. So therefore, we had 4 MiG-27s going up front. They were given air cover by the 2 51 Squadron MiG-21s, and they were carrying 4 500 kg bombs, if I am not mistaken, 500 kg bombs which were to be delivered on target by the first 2 airplanes. The other 2, Nachiketa's aircraft and his leader's aircraft, were carrying only rockets and guns. So after the bombs went, the first two 9th Squadron aircraft, that is Boxer 1 and 2, returned back to base. And the next 2 aircraft got into the dive, because the rockets have to be delivered from a closer height, at a lower height and at a closer range. So therefore, Nachiketa's leader got into the dive, and he could not spot the target for some reason. So he abandoned his dive and went around. He took a left turn, went around, and Nachiketa followed him. Nachiketa got the target into his sights and fired the first shots of the rockets. Having done that, he gave a call to his leader to come and fire at his rocket impact point rather, and then this carried on for 2 more. They did 2 more circuits like this, and they were able to punch a pretty good hole into the defenses over there. While he was coming for the third dive, Nachiketa fired his weapon and then gave a call that he has an engine problem and he is trying a relight. He had an engine failure, he gave a call, and he was trying a relight in the air. So his number two kept watching him. Nachiketa could not achieve the relight and he ejected from the aircraft. But his parachute could not be seen by anybody. So his number two thought that Nachiketa had gone. Right. So now what happened was the 9th squadron, the two MiG-27s, his leader was running low on fuel, so he could do a couple of more orbits to see where the aircraft has crashed and headed back for base. While he was heading back to base, he met up with the two MiG-21s coming from the bomb damage assessment, in which Ajay was flying, of course. Ajay was the leader, he was the flight commander of 17th Squadron that time. And Ajay crossed him and asked him, what is this news of Nachiketa? And then they went in, and for some reason, Ajay descended below, and he was warned that, there were missiles in the area and not to take precautions. Ajay, for some reason, went around looking for Nachiketa's crash site, and he went lower than the prescribed limits, I'm told. And then shoulder-fired missile hit his jet pipe, and he lost thrust. He had to eject over the enemy territory. Actually, his parachute landed over enemy territory, and thereafter it's all hearsay that he was shot while the parachute was coming down, and he tried to shoot from his little macro pistol that he had in his hand. But when his body was received, Colonel Basu was the person who did the autopsy on the body, and he claims that Ajay was shot in his knees and he was punched in his face, and he had many external injuries before he died. So therefore, he was tortured before he died. That is what it has come out very clearly after the investigations. So this is what the whole sortie was all about. Of course, the helicopters which were on standby they were made to standby for the Kazakhstan mission for this. They almost got airborne with 192 rockets each. And while they got airborne, they were asked to return back because by that time, Pakistan had already announced that Ajay was no more and Nachiketa was in their possession. So this whole sortie actually, in which both the aircrafts were lost within 35 minutes of each other, and thankfully the helicopters didn't go there. Otherwise, they would have also been one of them. We would have lost a few in that mission too. So this is all about the Nachiketa and Ajay Ahuja's sortie that I know. There will be many more details other people know, but this is what I have been told by the experts over there.
Very interesting, I must say. Okay, then let's get on to another thing which I think is equally interesting, and that's this Muntho Dhalo logistics base with the Pakistanis. And this was supposed to be one of the major bases. And
Yes.
Air Force carried out a huge attack on Muntho Dhalo. And
Yes.
I mean, that led to a lot of casualties in
Yes.
the logistics base for Pakistanis. There's also perhaps destruction of a lot of
Yes.
stuff which was meant to go forward.
Yes. So Muntho Dhalo, again, Muntho Dhalo, if you see, it's about 5.2 kilometers, if I'm not wrong, at height. But it has got a road connectivity right till its doorstep. So what the Pakistanis had made it into was a big bastion where they had stored a whole lot of ammunition, a whole lot of rations, and these were the kind of things that were going across to the other posts from. So it became a major logistics base. I have not got much knowledge about this, but whatever I have learned from the pilots who flew this mission is that this was a most fortified, kind of a camp of the Pakistanis with adequate number of Stinger missiles to guard it. Because if Muntho Dhalo goes, the entire logistics chain, the backbone of the logistics of the Pakistanis would break, and therefore it was no question that in case Muntho Dhalo went, they would have to withdraw. So there was this Spanish bomb, a Spanish bomb which was supplied by the manufacturers when they sold us the Mirage 2000. So we didn't have much, faith in that particular weapon and the manufacturer claimed that it will go where you want it to go. It's a very, very accurate. It's very beautifully matched with the aeroplane. So this was the time when the Spanish bomb, 250 kg bomb, was used, and it was a cheaper option than firing an LGB as such. And we used the 250 kg Spanish bomb, and we destroyed the complete Muntho Dhalo bastion, And from the radio intercepts later on, what we came to know was that there was complete panic in the Pakistan camp, and there was, radio calls going for additional troops, additional rations to come as soon as possible. Otherwise, there was no choice for them but to withdraw. Okay, so they lost about 50. People say they lost about 100 odd men in this 50 to 100 men in this in this particular attack, and I'm told that there are about total of 200 to 300 sorties which were done by the Mirages only from Munto Dhalo, Tiger Hill, and point 4388 in the Dras sector. These were three places which were concentration of air power was went in the war. So of course the Mirages use that. They've got a laser designator pod kind of thing on their aircraft, which they use. And of course, everybody is aware of the story of how the dumb bomb, as we call it, the dumb bomb was fitted with a Israeli kit, and it was made into a GPS-controlled weapon, which could reach the target better than the MiG-27s or the MiG-23s could fire.
We were talking about various kinds of operations. Commodore, can you tell us a little bit in detail about helicopter operations? Normally, helicopters should be used extensively, especially in the mountainous terrain.
Yes, there's no doubt about it that helicopters are very much required for any operation to be a success, and especially so in the hills where a large amount of task is to be done by these helicopters. And like I told you right in the beginning, that there was this recce that was carried out 1 year earlier with the helicopter. And we had already come to know that the Pakistanis had entered a year earlier and they were there. So the helicopters were playing a part right from then onwards. Right. So coming back to the Kargil operations as such, on the 10th, 11th of May, when things started hotting up, the augmentation of the already existing, there's a detachment of Mi-17s at Srinagar, 2 helicopters. It was being done by, I think, 129 HU from Hindon at that point in time. So they were augmented by 6 more helicopters. So we had, on the 10th, 11th, we had 8 helicopters already operating ex-Srinagar. So these were the Mi-17 class of helicopters. And the kind of duties that they were told to do initially were huge. Right from, dropping rations to dropping troops. And like I told you, they were taking the guns. They took a medium gun all the way in 3 parts, 7.5 tons of weight. They carried in 3 parts to a place and augmented our firepower. Also, 6 field guns, lower weight field guns were also lifted by helicopters in those times. But more than that, the very interesting story I was told by one of the helicopter pilots who took part in the operation. When all of them landed up in Srinagar, there was this little, they all got together in the base ops. And they were discussing as to how they're going to, deal with the situation that they were in. And for once, the fighter guys said, the helicopter is the ideal machine to be used in the hills. They could fly slow, they could fly low, and they could, deliver their weapons more accurately than the fighters would in this kind of terrain. So for once, the helicopter guys felt good about things, and we started. It was Air Marshal Patni was then the CNC, and Nana Menon was in Udhampur as the AOC Advanced Headquarters JNK. So they both were in the base ops, and there was a lot of heated arguments going on and who's to take on the targets and all that. So finally, the AOCNC decided, yes, let's try the helicopters in the lead role, and the fighters were supposed to give the support from the top in terms of putting the Pakistani heads down while we went in with the accurate attacks. So for the first time, the helicopters are now being used in offensive ops in a major role against the Pakistanis. So a total of 5 such missions were carried out in the days that followed. And the first mission, they all to Tiger Hill, Munto Dhalo, all the basic things that we have been talking about all through the talk. These are the targets for the helicopters. And the unfortunate part over here was that the CMDS, the countermeasures dispensing system that the aeroplanes are supposed to have, and they were not fitted on all the helicopters. So while some of the helicopters had them, but we had to fly with some helicopters without the CMDS. And in fact, that was to prove very, very lethal later on. So the first few missions, what we decided was that we will go tucked in close to each other, and one aircraft would fire the flares and shaft from the sides, and it would give adequate amount of cover to the aircraft which was following it. So this was being practiced, and once we delivered the weapons, the aircraft were ducking right into the valley, to the water valley bottom floor, and exiting as fast as possible. So that would again preclude hitting, I mean, the missile chap taking a pot shot at them. So the most vulnerable time for the helicopters during these were the attack time. The time of attack is about one minute in the almost 30 seconds to 40 seconds in the dive, and that is the time when the aircraft is very, very vulnerable. The aircrew are looking out at the target to fire. They are not looking anywhere else, and the aircraft is in a steady flight towards the target. So there was 5 such missions flown, and we managed to deliver a lot of good armament onto the targets. However, on the 5th day, on the 5th sortie, that was on 28th, if I'm not wrong, 28th, the last mission, the attack mission was flown, in which resulted in the fatality of one. We lost one helicopter in that. It was led by then Wing Commander Anil Kumar Sinha, who got a Veer Chakra, of course, after the operations. And he was the task force commander and the CEO of 129HU. So he was the leader of the mission. And there were 4 helicopters which were supposed to go. That morning, I think God was not on our sides. And 2 of the helicopters were giving trouble. The lead aircraft and the number 3 aircraft gave trouble. So what happened was Sinha's aircraft had problem. So he shifted from 1 to number 2. Then the number 2 crew went to number 3, and they found that number 3 was also having a problem. So there was a whole lot of melee going on the tarmac, and the cockpits were exchanged. And finally, the helicopters were delayed by as much as about 20 minutes on ground. 15 to 20 minutes delay, that's what I've been told. So by the time they took off for the mission, the fighters had already been on the target. They had done their thing, and they were on their way back. In fact, they were low on fuel, and they were on their way back when the helicopters went for their kill. And in this sortie, while we go in for the attack in a helicopter, we have to now create lateral separation between the aeroplanes, because you can't fly in tucked in and fire together. So the aircraft had to separate out when they reached over the target. And while doing so, Pundir's aircraft, that was number 3 aircraft, it was shot by a shoulder-fired missile, and they crashed immediately, and there was no chance of any survival. Incidentally, there's a very sad story attached to this. It was Mohilan. Mohilan was his co-pilot, and Pundir had just arrived on 27th evening by an AN-32, and he had got a cake, a birthday cake for Mohilan, and that was lying on the table. It was lying in the room, and Mohilan and Pundir both perished in the attack. And the cake, of course, later on, it was a stark reminder of how cruel war is all about. So all in all, this is the attack and the kind of use that the helicopters were made use of in Kargil. Other than that, of course, casualty evacuation. I've written about Colonel Gautam Khoth, who single-handedly did 65 casualty evacuations. 65, that's not a small number. And he picked up casualties when bombs were falling all around him. And he also got a VRC for the same. So there are a lot of heroes in the helicopter fleet who flew such missions during Kargil, and they brought laurels to the country. So all in all, helicopters did a very, very good job out there.
Right. Let's go a little further. There were certain constraints under which you were operating. You see, the government had laid down that you will not cross the line of actual control. Now, this must have had an impact on planning of your operations. After all, you've got to come in a particular direction to maybe attack a target. So how did it play out?
We have to stick to what the higher directions are. I mean, there is no going, even if we cannot attack a particular direction. You're right that we had a lot of constraints and restraints placed on us. The overall, if you see the overall action plan that was there, it was to kind of not allow the war to go out of hand. In case we had gone across and there would have been a melee in the air with the F-16 or something, it would have been gone into a full-blown conflict. So I think they took a good decision at that point in time. It's a personal opinion that we should stay on our own side. That was the Prime Minister's orders, and we did so. And unfortunately, both the crashes that took place, the pirates drifted into enemy territory and they were captured. So it was bad luck. It was bad luck for them. And other than that, of course, the constraint, we have to operate under constraints in war. There will be higher directions which we cannot undermine, because national interests are at the prime at that point in time. So all in all, we did not cross the border at any stage.
Right. One last question, Commodore.
Yeah.
You see, we are having a problem there in Eastern Ladakh, and there's been considerable build-up, though nobody's really expecting an all-out war or so right away. But just using your experience, can you say how are we poised now, especially in terms of squadron strength? Have we gone down from wherever we were during Kargil, or the new inductions have been very few? How do you rate it?
No, sir. I don't think new inductions have been very few. What has happened is the Su-30s started coming in immediately after the war. So we have got almost 250 plus aeroplanes of the Su-30 class. And if you compare it with the MiG-21 class, which has gone out in the meanwhile, all the types 75 to type 69, type 96, all of them gone out. So if you compare this with the kind of aircraft that we had in those times, I think we have a quantum jump in the air power that we can display today. That being said, if you see the number of radars that have come in from then, we have now got cover at low levels also in the area that we are talking about. So we have mountain radars, we have good quality of missile systems, the S-300, the S-400, the kind of system that we have gone from Russia. So they are very, very potent systems that are being used. So we have upgraded our aeroplanes also with better kits to make them more potent as far as air defense is concerned. So the recce surveillance capability, 100%, we have gone from where we were to where we are today. There's been a quantum leap. We are going to get the Rafales very soon. I'm told this weekend, 29th, immediately after the Kargil Divas. 29th, the first of the Rafales will land in from Paris. And I remember Tony Ghanawat sir once said in a meeting that if you get one Rafale, it is equivalent to 4 Su-30 class of aeroplanes. So I hope he meant what he said. And in case we have such a potent weapon with us in the future, I don't think we should be afraid of fighting anybody, including the Chinese. So we have come a long way, and we have upgraded our fleets. Yes, the demands will always be more than what the supply is, and so we'll always be constantly at it. 42 squadrons is what we need to fight two-front war, as what we have calculated, and it will be some time that we get them in line.
Right. Thank you, Commodore. I think that was a very fine interaction. I'm so glad we are ending on such a positive note, that we are so much better off than what we were during the Kargil operations. In case we do have to go into something, I'm sure the Air Force will display much, I would say, much greater courage and commitment, and we'll get the scope to display that kind of a courage, commitment, and grit that we've seen in Kargil already. Thank you so much for being with us, and thank you, viewers. Thank you for logging in. Please do log in time and again, and you'll find this kind of interesting discussions always there for you. Thank you, Commodore.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.